Tom Campbell here. I and MBT Events hope you like this video. It was made possible by donations from our supporters. If you're one of them, thank you so very, very much. If you're new to MBT and find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.
So I work in adult inpatient psychiatric setting where people are involuntarily committed, usually because they have often bizarre behavior, but it's because they are a danger to themselves or others or property. It's very generally speaking. And oftentimes, if they've been previously committed, then that's on their, in the US permanent record. And then if they're doing strange things again, or were just hospitalized within the past few weeks, they're liable to get thrown in all over again. So I was wondering if you could just say generally what is mental illness, and if you could comment on whether or not it's a problem. Of course, sometimes it's an issue of the brain itself for the IUOC, for the avatar, but I'm more interested in when it's an issue of consciousness and what that actually means.
Mm-hmm. So you say that all the people in your facility have committed themselves?
It's involuntary.
Oh,
So
it's all involuntary. They've all been committed by a judge through some kind of legal process.
A judge, yes, or they've been determined to need to be there by being screened, and then that's signed off by a doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people are voluntary, but then they'll see that their behavior is just so disruptive to other people who are voluntary, that they end up, being brought down to the more interesting section where I'm at.
Okay. All right, let's just talk about mental health in general. And as you say, mental health is a very broad kind of sweeping category, and there's people end up not mentally healthy for all sorts of reasons. It's a very a wide set of causes and circumstances that somebody might end up there. There's, I guess, to break it, start from the top and break it down into pieces, you would have physical-based illness, brain issues, bad brain chemistry or brain dysfunction of some sort is causing the mental illness. And then that, of course, is all a result of rule set things. There really is no brain, but the consciousness has to abide by how the rule set and that avatar, interact. What does the rule set say about that particular avatar? So if the rule set says that avatar is going to have, brain dysfunction, bad brain chemistry, not enough serotonin, not enough neurotransmitters in order to function properly, then the consciousness has to work with an avatar with that disability. So it just gives the consciousness another whole set of things to deal with and choices to make, that they have to work with that. So that's one cause, is that there's some kind of physical cause of the mental illness. I guess the next step down would be emotional causes. That someone's emotions have gotten strong enough and dysfunctional enough that they no longer can function well in our average society. I guess we call that normal society. Okay, so and it may just be emotional, that they can't control. Their emotions are kind of out of control. They're so strong. May not be really a brain chemistry issue. That could be a consciousness issue, or it could be a chemistry. It could be a physical issue. It just depends. It could be either one. And then, of course, after emotions, you'd probably get through like spiritual issues. And they would have to do with fears. They would have to do with attitudes. people's attitudes can be very dysfunctional. People's state of minds can be very dysfunctional. For instance, somebody can see themselves as a victim of society, or a victim of wealthy people, or a victim of this race or that race. There's all sorts of things that people can get into, and they see themselves victims, or they see themselves somehow troubled by what everybody else sees out in the world as just ordinary things, but for them it's very troubling things that they have a hard time. Well, I'd put that more under a kind of a spiritual dysfunction, where they're unable to interact with others successfully. That's more of a spiritual dysfunction. They can't do that. Now, there's no clear lines between any of these three. They're all, the social, the emotional, the physical. They all could be pieces of all three. Maybe working, or any mixture of those things would be possible. So it's not a clear thing, but I think those would be the basic three kind of areas where there's some sort of dysfunction going on. Now, we have to talk about, how do we define dysfunction? What's dysfunctional? In different cultures, behavior that would seem crazy and dysfunctional in some cultures is perfectly okay in other cultures. It's not a problem. So what is dysfunctional kind of really defines the illness. So in a way, then we get causes of the illness, which could be physical or emotional or spiritual, but the actual illness itself isn't defined by anything more than what the rest of society thinks about them, basically. So in many cases, there may be nothing's wrong with that person. They may be perfectly healthy individual, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, but because of their attitudes and beliefs or something else, they may be seen as dysfunctional. They may be seen as there's something wrong with them. They need to be locked up. So society defines what's healthy, what's not. And then we look for causes, which is probably a little backwards, but that's the way it works. Now, our society has built up a Homo sapiens, and they tend to have this attitude about anything different is frightening. If they meet somebody who's not like they are, then that's a little scary. That's risky. That comes back to, instinctual behaviors about things you don't understand could be possibly harmful. So anything you don't understand, which is anything that's different than what you're used to, could be possibly harmful, and you have a little fear about that, fear of the unknown. And some people have this a lot more than others. Some have just little bits of that, and some have none at all, and some are terribly afraid of the unknown. So we have a fear of people who are different than we are. And we also have rules that we set up called culture. We have culture, and the culture says these things are okay to do, these things are not okay to do. And as you know, there's all sorts of different cultures, and they don't necessarily agree on what's good things to do and what's not good things to do. So how do we define somebody that is mentally ill? Well, they don't fit into our culture. They don't do the things that other people do. They're different. And that's the main problem. That is, I guess it's unfortunate that it's like that we have this instinct that makes us negative toward anybody who's different. Because in diversity in differences is where great strength is. And diversity is where we have opportunities to learn and to grow and to expand. If everything's just the same, then that's a rut that's hard to get out of. So we actually grow and need a lot of diversity. So that's an issue here. So we have the mental health, I don't know what we call it, the mental health establishment or the mental health science or whatever, things that are too much different get defined as dysfunctional or bad because they don't fit in. They're like square pegs in round holes. They just don't seem to fit in. Now, that doesn't, in my mind, necessarily say that they're bad or dysfunctional. It just says they don't fit in. Maybe the culture has, square holes when it should have some round holes, but the culture just doesn't happen to have any round holes in it. So people that are round holes, don't fit in. They don't work in that culture. That may be entirely the fault of the culture. Those square holes may be the problem, not the round holes that don't fit into it. But we have kind of the tyranny of the majority here in that. So if all the majority of the holes are square, well, then those round ones aren't so good. They immediately get defined as negative, wrong, need to be fixed. See, because they're not like us. So this is kind of a much bigger view, a much broader view than you typically will find, in the mental health fields, about mental health. But so some people who would be considered dysfunctional because they just don't seem to fit here, it's not because there's really anything truly wrong with them other than the fact that they are in some way unable to abide by the rules that we make that define what's good. You don't do these things. These things are considered rude. Okay? If you do these rude things and you keep doing these rude things, then you might end up in a psychiatric ward because you do these rude things. Now, are those things really rude, or does the culture just have, maybe the culture has mental illness about those things? And what the person's doing in a bigger picture may not be rude at all. It just may be rude because that culture is very uptight about those things. They're not very mentally healthy. So when the culture has a mental health problem, then the people that kind of rub that problem in the wrong way are determined to be unhealthy, even if the reverse is what's true. The culture could be the ones that are all twisted up about something, and the individuals may be healthier, but they're still different. And when they're different, the culture's the big thing, the individual's the small thing. So what happens is the big thing usually overruns the small thing. And no matter who's the one that's dysfunctional, the culture always wins those fights because the culture is large and ubiquitous and institutionalized everywhere. The individual's just an individual, so it's hard to fight it. So we have to have a really broad sense of this category of mental illness. Just going on and saying, yeah, all these people are crazy and there's all something wrong with them and they need to be fixed is not necessarily true. Okay, they may just be round pegs that don't fit into square holes. So one thing that I would say is that it would help our mental health again, it's an establishment, I'll say, but are just mental health attitudes. If we were more open to people being different, if we were more accepting of people being different. Now, if the people who are put into these institutions, if they're violent, well, then that's a problem. That's a problem. Violence is not something that is acceptable, in the society, particularly if it's kind of random violence. It doesn't maybe even have a pattern. It's maybe just random violence. Or maybe it does have a pattern. Every time somebody sees another person with green eyes, maybe they go berserk, You don't know. But those kinds of things where violence is the problem, well, then I would tend to agree with the culture of the society. Violence is something that's a very high entropy thing that, no, you can't just randomly be violent in a culture. And if you won't stop being violent in the culture, then we'll put you someplace where you can't be violent in the culture. And that's when they end up in an institution. So that's probably what a fair majority, I guess, of these people probably fall into that category where they might be violent. But there's even with violence, there's often other issues. It's not necessarily just that the person is just a violent person. It could be that the person is just simply one of those round pegs that doesn't fit in the square hole very well, and people start bullying them, start giving them a hard time. And eventually, they react to that with violence. So it could be that some of these people that are violent is because the culture pushes them into violence or creates the violent reactions by refusing to allow, round holes to exist in the culture, or by refusing to really listen to what it is they have to say. So sometimes the violence is there because they've been scooped up and thrown into an institution. So if you happen to think in your own mind that you're a good guy doing good things, and somebody scoops you up and throws you into an institution because they disagree with that, well, some people might become violent when that happens. They may try to fight their way out. Well, then that, of course, reduces then down to a spiritual issue. You see, if you were more spiritually developed, then violence would not be an answer. Even if other people mistreated you, even if other people were trying to bully you and force you, you wouldn't necessarily just meet that with violence. Fighting fire with fire. If your culture is violent towards you, well, getting violent toward the culture is not a very clever idea. Again, you're small, they're big, and they will always win. But if your spiritual quality is such that violence is your answer, when you're bullied, you try to fight back with fists or weapons or something, well, then you're going to be judged a violent, dysfunctional person and put in an institution. Now, had that person been dealt with in other ways, they may never have gotten violent. You see, so that's what I mean by it's all these things are connected to each other. Any one case, you can't just say, oh, well, here's their problem and, have a real simple fix for it. That doesn't work. It's it's a very complex thing. And anybody who's in a particular way, there's probably 50 different ways they might have ended up that way. And some of them may have been entirely unnecessary had they just been dealt with differently. Now you get to the point where they have, they feel beaten. All right, they've been grabbed up, they've been put in an institution, they're beaten. Now they're sort of put in jail, and now they just have to deal with it. And maybe that bubbles up out of them as anger, and every once in a while they punch one of their inmates, or somebody's there, or staff member or something, just because they feel frustrated, violent, They're stuck. They're trapped. They don't see any way out. And in their mind, they see it's all very unfair. You know? So you have that. Now, how many of those, had we treated them with more respect early on, would not be there? And how many would be there no matter how you treat them, because they just happen to be violent people, you know, and their whole reaction to anything they don't like is to be violent. So it's a difficult space, and we in our mental health tend to treat everybody kind of rough, kind of, you know, we don't have a real fine-tuned sensitivity to people and where they are and where they've been and what might be making them that way and what we can do with them. We don't seem to have a lot of that. We tend to look at them, see they're dysfunctional, and then put them away where they can't bother other people. We don't spend a whole lot of time really working with them. Now, we do, it just kind of depends on where you are. If, let's say, you're in a state hospital that is pretty much just a warehouse, well, then what I just said is mostly true. They don't spend a lot of time with those people trying really to rehabilitate or fix or whatever. They just warehouse there. And they're put on drugs to keep them easily, you can handle them more easily because they're drugged all the time. So you basically have a bunch of people who are blotto with drugs to make them easy to handle, and that's it. They're warehoused. They just live there in that drug state all the time and interact however they may, a little bit that they can interact, and that's just going to be their life until they die or something. You know, they're just stuck there. So that's typically state mental institutions tend to be the bottom, the bottom line. You know, if you have some money to spend, you start in a institution that's a little better than that, where they do look at you and maybe try to give you therapy and try to help understand your issues and help you, to where you can get out. The idea is that, they'll help you go back into the normal society if they can get you to do that. And that those places, though, are a little more expensive because they have psychiatrists and other people who are actually trying to help, trying to heal, trying to help these people get a better attitude so they can interact with the society. But all of that is more expensive. And it's not so much that the state institutions have real bad attitudes, it's just they're overwhelmed. That's where people end up at the end of the line. That's often where they end up. So the state has hundreds of them, many hundreds of them, and you can't afford many hundreds of psychiatrists and many hundreds of therapists, and all of that becomes really expensive, and the states don't spend that much money on it. They just spend as much money on it as they need to get by, which typically makes it a warehouse rather than a helping place. Sure, they have psychiatrists, and sure, they try to work with the people, but it's like one for 50 or 60, and it's not all that helpful. So that's kind of the bottom of the barrel. But there's other places that are not that bad, privately owned things. And if there is a little money to spend, or if the state is a little more interested in trying to help people with mental issues, then there is some money for that, and people can get help and can get better and can leave and go on with their lives and succeed. There was about 30, maybe 30, 40 years ago, there was a movement called de-institutionalization. It started then, kind of peaked as a concept, and I'm not sure where it is now, whether it's still entrenched in the mental health facilities or whether it's an old idea that's died. But they found that there were a lot of people that if you could hold their hands once they got out, if you could help them get along in the society. They didn't have to live in mental institutions. They weren't really violent. They weren't really a problem, but they didn't have the skills to get by in the larger society. So they eventually ended up back, in the institution. If you just send them out the front door and say, well, go try to live a nice life, they would fail. But if you had organizations that would help them, take them by the hand, find a place for them to live, help them figure out how to, find them a job or something they could do, make sure that they could walk to the grocery store, and once or twice a week, somebody pops in on them and asks them how they're doing and what kind of problems they're having and help them solve the problems. That if you did that, you could get like 20, 30% of the people institutionalized back out in society with jobs, paying taxes, and entirely functional. That what was needed was a path out. And I'm not sure where that is now, but what that says is the people in the institutions, many of them don't necessarily have to be there. But you can't just open the door and push them out the door and expect that they're going to do well. They really need a lot of hand-holding on the outside before they can get integrated back into the culture. And they find the same things with prisons. The prisons have exactly the same thing. Somebody's been in prison for 20 years or 30 years, and you toss them out the door and say, all right, your time's up. They have a really hard time getting back into the culture. There's a lot of sentiment against them right away. People treat them kind of different. Yeah, you're the con. Oh, you're the crazy guy. That got out of the thing. So they need some de-institutionalization resources spent. And I think the same is true of prisons and mental institutions. If we spend a little more money on integrating these people and helping them get back into a functional space over maybe not just 3 weeks, but like 3 years or 4 or 5 years, kind of stick with them, we probably have a whole lot more success with getting people out of the institutions. So many people are in the institution just because they're in the institution. And if you just throw them out the door, they can't function well enough. They can't get it back together, particularly in a society where there's already a lot of biases against them. It's just a hard row to hoe, particularly if you're marginal. Yes, you have issues, you're different, but you could work at a job, you could bag groceries, you could do things that would keep you out and functional and make friends and have a life other than being in an institution. So there's just, when we talk about mental health, there's just this huge area of discussion. Mental health is not a simple issue. It's probably one of the most complex issues that the society has to deal with. What do you do with people who don't fit in? It's basically the question. And how much money do you spend helping them to fit in? How much effort does the society go taking someone that doesn't fit in, trying to help them fit in, and then only the ones that can't be helped to fit in then end up in institutions. But that middle step, that's kind of the de-institutionalizing step that you have. Once they're in, you have to help them get out. Well, there should be some money spent up in the front of the people who are kind of headed that way. How do you help them not go in? What do you do if you had people working there, social workers and other people working with those people saying, you're on your way to being committed to a mental institution if you, can't get that anger under control, or if you can't get, let's work on that. Let's work on that anger management and have somebody working with that person on anger management. That might be all it takes to keep that person out. So my thinking is that a big failure we have is that we treat it too simply. Somebody doesn't fit in. All right, we give them another chance. We tell them, hey, bud, straighten up. We don't really help them straighten up. We don't give them, a lot of guidance, a lot of hand holding, and a lot of that. We just tell them to straighten up. And after the second or third time, well, in the institution they go. And that's it. And it's the same way when we let them out. We throw them out the door and they mess up. Well, we stick them back in. And after we've done that twice, we don't throw them out anymore. That's it. They're just there for life. Send them off to the state, the state warehouse, that sort of thing.
If they
And
do
we
anything
could,
strange, they're instantly committed once again,
yeah,
and it's on their record. It's very sad.
yeah. So that's kind of, as I see it, the big failure of mental health in our culture is we don't have a lot of sense of respecting these people and trying to help them. We just want to weed them out and get rid of them. All right, this person can't control their emotions, and they're pugnacious. All right, why is that? And could we help them? Could we do something about that? Well, if the family has a lot of money, well, yeah, they could do that. They could help them. But if not, nothing happens. Well, then they get to the point where they're a big nuisance. We get rid of them, put them in an institution someplace, take them out of the society. And we don't make a lot of effort to help them not get in there, nor do we make a lot of effort to help them get out. And I think that is really a big failure of our culture with dealing with the mentally ill. Yes, there'll always be some people who are just violent or will just commit crimes or they're just don't belong, here with the rest of us. They need to be in an institution someplace. Yes, there'll be people like that. But I suspect our institutions have a whole lot of people in them that aren't like that, that could have been helped to not end up in the institution or could be helped to get out of the institution if we really put the resources to it. But in general, our culture doesn't care that much because the quality of consciousness in Homo sapiens is not very high. What that means is that most people are still pretty self-centered. And you're a problem to me, put you someplace, lock the door. You're not a problem to me anymore. Problem solved. And the fact that that's an individual who maybe could be a contributor, maybe has some potential to do, but we're not making much effort to find it or to help them find it. So that's kind of the way mental health is now. The culture is basically self-centered, so it doesn't care that much about people who don't fit in. If you don't fit in, you are going to be dealt with very harshly, and you might say very unfairly, and you're not necessarily going to be given chances, or nobody's going to try to understand you. You're just taken out of the system and mostly forgotten by the rest of the society. Not necessarily forgotten by your mother and father or loved ones. They'll come visit you perhaps, but the rest of the society kind of writes you off and they're done with you. And that's kind of the way we treat mental illness.
What I think is terrifically sad about our society is that, like you're saying, mental health is extremely complex because there's this overlap of people who are, let's say, criminals that get stuck in a private profit incentivized prison industry. And I'll add 48% of inmates have dyslexia. I mean, that in itself is a mild form of, a brain abnormality. But
Mm-hmm.
some of these people would be better off if they didn't have to get ground through our educational system that focuses on, test taking, which they might have just, a visual difficulty with. 25% of the homeless suffer traumatic brain injuries from violence, which is another overlap. And then those who are mentally ill, let's say they just have a difficult time not controlling impulses, they're just too loud, they laugh to themselves too much. they can get thrown into a mental institution for that. Whereas we could simply let them live somewhere with acoustic paneling. They can laugh and yell to themselves and their delusions as loud as they want, but let them be who they are. Instead, stuff them in the hospital because someone's getting a little bit off of it. And that's the thing that's so frustrating. Worse yet, or just as much, is that we define these people as being successful in our society if they're able to, pay taxes and generate money. And unfortunately, some of them just are not good at that because they don't perceive time well. They are too flighty. If it's not an emotional issue, they cannot concentrate well. Schizophrenia is defined in part by the negative symptoms, where they have it's called avolition. They have no will for long periods of time, no thoughts for long periods of time, just somewhere else, which is another question in itself that I'm going to ask. But it's just awful because they can't integrate. And since they can't integrate, the fourth overlap with, prison and drug use or addiction and mental health issues is they're poor. In my state, if you make over, I think it used to be like $900 a month, working part-time or working full-time, you no longer receive any money. And then you're on your own, completely broke, and you have to, pay for your own housing, and you're stuck constantly worrying about money. I worked doing social work to help people with severe mental illness that were formerly homeless transition into society. All I'm helping them with all the time is going to a food pantry, getting assistance on their electrical or their heating bills. This is no way to live. So to me, it seems like you're absolutely right. It is an attitudinal issue, and it's a normative problem, not so much for the people who can't fit in, but we just don't have enough holes for all these different shaped people. They're strange, they're interesting, and I think we could find really clever ways for them to contribute that don't involve them having to, involve themselves with drudgery, just ringing up people to buy, retail goods. Instead, they could be coming up with some fascinating like sentences and prognostication. I mean, if we were to teach them to tap into their intuitive side, I mean, Christ, you've described people with schizophrenia as those living in multiple reality frames. I mean, what could really get done if we were able to, bring them forth and then see what we can all share together when it comes to information. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that entirely. We well, it's because we're so self-centered as a culture that we don't explore all those issues because we only mainly care about ourselves. This person is a problem. Get rid of them. Yeah, that's kind of the attitude, and it's unfortunate because, I noticed that in a lot of old societies, by that it's mostly the societies of, I guess what now would be called indigenous people. The people have been around a long time. Societies, cultures that go back millennia, and in these old societies, often they had places for people who were different. Like I remember one of the movies I watched, there was an American Indian tribe who would have a place for a man who did everything backwards, did everything different. So he did not go out and hunt with the men. He didn't make war with the men. He stayed with the women, and he did women's things. And when he went to walk anywhere, he'd walk backwards, and he would get into the water. He'd kind of go into the water, but then he'd get out and rub himself with dirt. It was that kind of thing. So, and there was a name for it. He had some kind of thing, but he also was he was valued, within the tribe. He had some particular thing to play. Now, maybe he also had visions of some sort. I don't know, but he was. They didn't have many of those kinds of people in a tribe, but they had some. But they let them be kind of the way they were, and everything was fine. All right, they didn't hunt, but they still got fed. Well, they weren't useful in a hunt because they weren't that organized. They weren't able to kind of make their minds work that way. But you could still get them to carry pots around, and you could get them to do things. So they were doing the things that they could do to be helpful, mostly to the women, and mostly that had to do with helping the women with things that were probably heavier because they're bigger, they were male, you know. So they had things that they could do, and the tribe would use them to do those things, and they were, you know, they weren't they weren't hit, they weren't smacked, they weren't treated badly. They were just different. But they say, well, what can we use this? What can we use this person for? You know, they don't, they're not like us, but it's not like they're useless. There's things that they can still do to help contribute. So let's let them do those things, and we'll keep them around. So I noticed that, and other indigenous cultures likewise tended to have things like that that would allow people who were radically different, who were, you know, round pegs with a bunch of square hole cultures, somehow do whatever it is they did. You know, get along and what contribute however they could contribute, and basically you take care of them, bring them along, and you know whether they were dysfunctional because they weren't very bright or whether they had other kinds of issues didn't matter that much. They were a lot more open to differences in these very old civilizations, it seems, than we are. And maybe our civilization's just not old enough that we've grown up enough to develop those kinds of attitudes yet. But in any case, yeah, I've always been taken by the very different attitudes that some of the what we call primitive people have. That to me seems a lot less primitive than the attitudes that we have.
And a lot less entropic because you're just allowing people to be as they are, even if they can't be maximally productive. At least then they aren't living lives of suffering. Often I'll see people who are stuck in psychosis, or as we'll say less judgmentally, responding to internal stimuli. A lot of times, if they're not laughing to themselves, they're relitigating these arguments out loud under their breath or to themselves. It's that same kind of feedback loop of violence and frustration and feeling, small and then taken advantage of because they don't fit in. And then they end up places where people don't typically want to be taking care of them. And then they're, forced to do things that they don't want to do, rules that shouldn't be, foisted on them in the first place because they're here because they have a difficult time fitting in. So now in this place, they're going to have to follow even more strict rules somewhere they don't want to be, somewhere that they associate with being held down and forcefully injected because they're irritated that they're there. I mean, it's a it's a sad thing all around.
That institutions would be very surprised at the number of those kinds of people that if you had a good program to help deinstitutionalize them, that could be deinstitutionalized, that a lot of their problem is the way we treat them. If you could get them out, at least even just a little, just start with day trips, start with, a half an hour, out someplace with somebody else. But all of that takes time and money. See, it takes resources. You have to
Mm-hmm.
hire people to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. We just don't care enough as a culture to put those kinds of resources with it. I guess if you take a small tribe of, 50 or 60 people and they had one or two people that were really odd, well, it wasn't much trouble to deal with them. But when you have a big society and now you're actually going to have to spend resources because there's thousands of people like that and individuals don't want to take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to pay somebody to take care of them. And I think we could deinstitutionalize an awful lot of people, and you'd find that once they got out and were treated a little better and got to do things, a lot of that anger and a lot of that dysfunction would tend to fall away. It's partly created by the circumstances that we put them in. So yes, we could do a whole lot better
Mm-hmm.
in the fields of mental health. We are still pretty barbaric in our treatment of people who are different. It's mostly just get them out of here, lock them up. We don't want to see them anymore. You know, that's sort of an attitude. But these are people. These are humans. They have potential. They have things to offer and give. They are sort of like us, except they're different in a way. Well, let's see if we can't make something useful out of that
Mm-hmm.
difference. Like you say, the schizophrenic, many of them, their only problem is was that they were too honest about what they were seeing and feeling. When somebody said, "Oh, you saw what? You know, little green people with pointy ears," and they said, "What?" And they get all excited. Yeah, yeah, right. And their ears are real pointy, and they're too honest. Whereas if they just kept it to themselves and said, "No, I didn't see anything like that. I was just kidding," you know, and learn to keep their mouth shut, they could probably go on through life and have a perfectly normal life and have friends with their little green people with the pointy ears, both. And they could do both of those things without really causing a lot of trouble. But as soon as we find somebody who's different than us, then immediately there's something wrong with them, and then they have to be fixed. Well, we fix them with drugs for the most part, which means just load them up with so many psychotropic drugs that they don't really have a mind anymore. You know, they're going through life as zombies. Well, they're not much trouble. They don't fuss and they don't see any people. You know, they don't see any green people, but they can't really interact with other people either. You know, they're just kind of so let people be who have different visions if they're not violent, if it doesn't cause them trouble. And if it does cause them trouble, try to find out why. And what is the fear that makes them violent? And can you work with that? And yes, there will be some that just need to be put in institutions and taken out of the society. No doubt about it. But our broad grasp and throwing everybody in there, we probably put, you know, a lot more people than have to be in there. You know, it's sort of also like, you know, you have, when you talk about the law and our legal system and how that works, we lock people up. But we have this idea that we don't want to lock up people who are innocent. You know, locking up people who are innocent is not a good idea. So we have this filter. Okay, what's the burden of proof? Well, if it's, you know, maybe only zero point 0.1, maybe only 10% probability that they're innocent, 90% that they're guilty, well, do we lock them up if it's 10 to 1 like that? Or do we have to have only 1/100th, you know, 1% of the probability that they're guilty? Or only, you know, where do you draw that line to where your system is going to put innocent people in a prison? You have to draw that line someplace. You know, is it 50-50? Well, they might, 50-50, they might be guilty. And, you know, what do we do with that? Do we just go ahead and put them in prison anyway because they might be guilty? You know, so it's a similar kind of thing. You know, you have a system and you want to get rid of the people who are guilty. I don't mean get rid of them, rehabilitate them, you know, put them someplace, work with them. You want to separate them out if they're guilty of violent crimes. But where do you draw the line? Because if you say, all right, I don't want to put anybody in prison, you know, make it 10 to 1. I would rather have 10 guilty people stay out of prison than I would have one innocent person go to prison. So make it 10 to 1. Well, there's still going to be a fair amount of guilty people who don't go to prison, and you only have, you know, one, you know, that goes to prison who's totally innocent because the system, you know, because the system can't be perfect. You're never going to have a system that says, this system's so perfect, only guilty people will ever go to prison. You know, that doesn't work. Any system is going to have a flaw in it. It's going to be able to send some innocent people to prison. Well, we have to draw that line someplace. And unfortunately, that line is not drawn in the same place for everybody. At least in our culture, if you happen to be young, black, and male, well, that line is a different place, than if you're older, maybe female and white, then you're dealt with differently. So that's part of the problem, and I think that's true in mental health too. The people who have funds are treated a lot better in the mental health line than the people without funds. And the people who have advocates, family members who come in and advocate for them, they get a lot better deal than the people who don't have that. So everybody is not treated the same. Some people are better off than others. But we do the same thing in mental health. How much are we willing to just lock people up because they're a nuisance and we don't want to deal with them? That could be they could be happy, healthful, contributing lives if we just took the time to work with them, or it's too much trouble. We don't want to work with them. It's just too much trouble, costs too much money. You just get rid of them. Well, it's the same with prisoners. Well, if everybody, they could be guilty, then lock them up if they could be guilty. Well, that's the kind of law and justice that you had, say, under a king, right? When the king made all the rules, well, you could be guilty, lock them up. That's not a good legal system that does that, because all kinds of people could be guilty. But
And you can see
yeah,
all the people in the middle of the hierarchy are now the ones who are getting rich, those who own and work at the administrative levels of the private prisons, or those who own organizations that allow the mentally ill to, take day trips and be in supervised housing, but go no further than that, because then they're, that company would be disincentivized, because then they lose a client. Whereas
yeah,
that money could go to the person who could need it and then enrich their lives and give them more support until they can maybe be on their feet, or and if they can't, fill in the gap so they could live the life that they would be happy with.
yeah. Well, just a little better organization could fix some of that. Like you could give those companies that, let's say, do help people go out of prison in certain they get paid by the individual. You say they're not incentivized to get those people to go out for good because they get paid, but they could get a bonus every time one of those people got out and stayed out on their own for more than a year, with just maybe weekly visits, and then maybe only monthly visits, and then maybe only yearly visits. Well, every time they got that to happen, then you get a bonus. So, and that bonus is worth a whole lot more than what you get just for keeping one. Now they're incentivized to get them out and to keep them out and to give them the resources they need to help them stay out. And so that could be done. We just need to organize that kind of process better. But we generally don't. And again, we don't, because most of us just don't care that much.